Right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it a minute just to make sure everyone makes it into the room. All right, we might as well get started here in Zoom land. Welcome to Better Be Prepared. It's a webinar series that we run out of the Atlantik-Brücke when we primarily invite experts from the US or otherwise far away to give us technical briefings. It's been a long summer. A lot has moved in the trade space. And I thought that there would be no one better to ask than a former colleague and counterpart of mine, Peter Harrell, who is currently at Georgetown University, but was also served in a very crucial position in the Biden administration, namely as the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness. And to note, I believe the word competitiveness was added to the title of the position when you arrived. That's probably not an accident. But again, someone whose input I've always deeply respected for being extremely technical, but also fair and non-polemical about the various things that the United States has undertaken under, let's just say, over the past 3 administrations in the trade, economics, and economic statecraft space. So again, I hope this can be an open conversation. This is the Q&A mode, or if your Zoom speaks German, it's the F&A mode. So please don't hesitate to add your comments and questions as we go throughout. We're just going to start here and banter, but I'll do the best to bring your questions in as they come in, and we'll have a nice dorky hour together. Peter, once again, thank you so much for joining. Good morning. I think we could start, maybe as agreed, if you could just give us an overview of what's happened over the past couple of months. What have been the major initiatives coming out of the Trump administration? And of course, we will also be remiss if we didn't speak about global reactions and specifically what we anticipate coming out of Europe. So,
yeah. Well, first, Julia, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to see you. It's been great working with you over the years, and I really appreciate you reaching out and giving me the chance to talk with you and all of your colleagues this morning. So maybe just a kind of overview of where I see U.S. trade policy today and where I see the Trump administration trade policy and kind of what has happened over the last couple of months. So the way I think of the arc under Trump term 2, and I hope we get a chance to talk about what might come after Trump later in the hour. But the way I think of it is we had the president last year come out of the gate, last spring, April of last year, with a bunch of really high, really sweeping, really fast tariffs, which he then had to walk back a little bit, and which he then decided, based on some feedback from his advisors and pushback from foreign countries, that he wanted to turn into a set of deals with major trading partners around the world. And so we saw, over the course of the last year, and in Europe, you think about this as the Turnberry agreement, but we saw the Trump administration negotiate these kind of trade deals with, I think, 19 or maybe 20 trade partners now, which if you also add in Canada and Mexico, which are in kind of a different negotiating track, we have kind of deal negotiations now with trading partners that cover something like 80 to 90% of American trade. And I think the story of the last, sort of 7 or 8 months has been, one of the stories, I should say, the last 7 or 8 months has been kind of the implementation of these deals. So we have seen, not with the European Union, but we have seen with I think 11 or 12 countries now, the Trump administration, including like Malaysia and Argentina and Bangladesh, a whole bunch of countries, some Central American countries, they actually have turned these deals into sort of detailed 50, 60-page trade agreement texts, which I think gives some sign of where the Trump administration wants to go. And then they're working on trying to turn the deal text with other trading partners, the sort of framework agreement, things like the Turnberry agreement, the framework agreements with other trading partners into more durable deals. So that's one thing we have seen kind of big picture is like trying to turn a very high level of tariffs and a very chaotic tariff process of last year into deals. And I think that has been USTR Jameson Greer's kind of overarching priority over the last, or one of his overarching priorities over the last 7 or 8 months. Another big priority, because a big part of these deals is maintaining high US tariffs, has been the Trump administration scrambling to create under US law a durable legal basis for the tariffs. So last year when Trump first announced all of his tariffs, he used this 1977 emergency powers statute to impose the tariffs. Our Supreme Court in February of this year ruled that those tariffs were illegal. But the Trump administration did not give up on the tariffs. What they did was they had a kind of two-phase legal fallback plan. The first of which was something called Section 122, which kept 10% tariffs in place through July. And now they have something called Section 301, which they are using to maintain 10% to 12.5% tariffs on most of American trading partners, including the EU. And these 301 tariffs are sort of, from a formal perspective right now, the Trump administration would say they are over quote unquote forced labor issues. I think we should just be direct. That's pretty much completely a pretext. They needed to come up with some under the way Section 301 works. In order to have a tariff, you need to have some unfair trade practice that justifies the tariff. Trump administration chose forced labor. But I think we should just be direct. It is a pretextual focus on forced labor. But from a European perspective, I think the point to keep in mind is this is currently the US legal basis for the 10% tariffs you guys are facing. The Trump administration does have an investigation going on also under 301 into quote unquote industrial overcapacity. They could eventually use that other 301 to raise tariff rates on Europe back up to the 15% that was agreed under the Turnberry agreement, currently at 10. They could raise it up to 15%. They have not yet released the investigation on that 301. It would take at least a couple of months from when they release that to when those tariffs would come into force. So what I would say from a European perspective, it is the timing of any increase from 10 to 15 currently is up in the air. I think the Trump administration, as it kind of juggles various legal balls here at home and as that looks out across the world, I do think the Trump administration broadly does intend to implement the terms of the Turnberry agreement. You know, we saw that when they implemented the 301 tariffs. I don't mean to be too much in the weeds, the way they kind of interlaced the new 301 tariffs with prior, old, what we call MFN tariffs. These are longtime US tariffs. The way they kind of connected those two, they did in a way that is consistent with what they committed to under Turnberry. Wasn't what they did for all other countries. They actually cut the EU, the way different US tariffs interact. They cut the EU a better deal than some other countries. And I took that as a sign of, they do currently, while they are mad at the European Union over tech regulation, over various things, they are broadly intending to honor the Turnberry agreement. So that's kind of, if issue one over the summer has been, deal implementation, deal negotiation around the world. Issue two has been legal, the U.S. domestic legal issues. I would say issue three for the Trump administration from an American perspective over the summer has been our new trade war against Canada, which I don't know the extent to which you guys in Europe are following this, but about 6 or 8 weeks ago, the president announced he would be imposing 50% tariffs on about $20 billion of U.S. imports from Canada. Those are now going into, are now in force. Canada's threatening retaliation. Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney are also having sort of various online social media disputes. This is what we all have to deal with here in the United States these days. But, we seem to be having a trade war with our neighbor to the north. I think the important thing for you guys to keep in mind is that what is actually going on here in North America, and the Trump administration's focus on North America, is that the U.S. over the course of the last couple of months has been trying to renegotiate the USMCA trade deal. This is the trade deal between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that goes back to Trump's first term, that used to be called NAFTA, but the North American trade deal. Trump has been trying to renegotiate that, and he has been much happier with how the negotiations with the Mexicans have been going than with the Canadians. The Mexicans have been willing to put some items on the table, like raising Mexican tariffs on China, which is something the U.S. has wanted, like indicating that the Mexicans are willing to deal with some long-standing disputes we've had with them over agricultural trade issues. So Trump has felt like the Mexico negotiations are going well. He has felt like the Canada negotiations, on the other hand, are not going well. And while they had sort of a stated reason for the tariffs on Canada, what's really going on is trying to put pressure on Canada to increase, to get more serious from the Trump administration's perspective about the USMCA renegotiations. So I think that's sort of the third thing we have seen play out over the summer. And maybe I'll pause there because I know we have a number of other topics to talk about.
Thank you so much. And I think it's an excellent overview. I mean, I guess my first question would be, what do you mean there, as you said, like forced labor is a pretext? I don't think anyone believes it's anything but. I do think that some effective tariff rates are higher under the forced labor 301 on countries that actually have forced labor issues than ones that don't. Again, I think what it's often difficult for those on the outside observing it to say is which ideology is currently the strongest, right? Is it about Chinese transshipment? Is it about overcapacity? Is it about tariff income? Is it about placating bond markets? Is it about a trade imbalance?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's clear that all these play a role, but but one usually tends to be more important than the others at a certain point in time. So what do you think the balance is right now?
Yeah, President Trump, when he was running for his second term, said on the campaign trail when trade came up, he said he wanted to see a 10% universal U.S. tariff. That's what he said. And he said he wanted to see something higher on China. And that kind of varied between 30 and 50%, depending on the mood. And I think that we just have to interpret this as Trump, in some sense, has wanted to see, a 10% or higher U.S. tariff for many, many years. And he said he was going to do it, and now he's going to do it. And basically, any American economist would say this is not great economics. I think many American geopolitical strategists would say the way in which these tariffs are being applied, at a very comparable rate to core U.S. allies, to kind of non-aligned countries, and to China, a very similar rate. I think would say this makes no sense geopolitically. But Trump's the president, and he's got lawyers around him who are working very hard to come up with legal theories to let him do this. And I think we just have to sort of stipulate that Trump wants to see most U.S. imports tariffed at 10 or 15%. And although there is ongoing lawsuits against the current round of tariffs that will play out over probably a year or two, at least for the time being, until those lawsuits play out, kind of no matter what any of our trading partners do, you're going to have a baseline tariff rate of 10 or 12 or 15%. And the question is really, for our trade partners as part of the deals. Can you swallow that and take a deal that kind of will cap those rates at that 10 or 12.5 or 15%? Or do you want to risk an even higher rate on a number of products? And, we could have economic debates. We could talk about the revenue. He clearly really wants the revenue. But I think that at the end of the day, it's just best understood as Trump has decided he wants a 10% tariff or higher. His lawyers have given him a theory to have a 10% tariff, and that is what we are going to live with.
What?
That's not to say there aren't interesting things he's doing on China. Like we can have an unpack, like what he wants out of China, how his administration is thinking about China. But all of that is kind of on top of the 10%. I think there's basically nothing that our trade partners can do to get out of 10 or 15% tariffs. It's kind of, that's the minimum. And then the question is kind of higher tariffs versus, other kinds of trade-offs above that. But he's just not going to get rid of a 10%.
I mean, again, I don't want to speak for my members on the on the list here, and they can certainly. I would welcome them to please chime in if they see this otherwise. But it's, I mean, the German industries would on just on average say they're passing on 80 to 85% of the tariff onto consumers, and so I mean, and most of these goods are. The utility curve is pretty strong. So
yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say, it's interesting. So first of all, yes, I mean, basically with a handful of exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of the economists who have looked at this have concluded that Americans are paying the majority of the cost of these tariffs. It just seems to be, 90% of the economists agree on that. There are a few outlier economic takes, but really most of them would say it's 80, 90% are being paid by Americans. Most of those same economic reports would argue that the tariffs have not actually meaningfully contributed to U.S. manufacturing capacity increases. So we're not seeing a lot of the promised benefit there. And politically, I mean, the polling suggests they are not popular. I mean, polling here in the U.S. is suggesting, 60 to 65% of Americans think Trump has gone too far on tariffs. I mean, it varies a little bit depending on exactly how the question is asked, but solid majority of Americans seem to be against the tariffs, and that actually is part of why I think you have to read this as Trump is just very, very personally committed to the tariffs, because most economists think this policy doesn't make particular sense. It is being passed on to Americans, and it's not popular, but he's continuing to stand by it. Now, I think there is, we can have a discussion about what would come after Trump. I think there is support on a bipartisan basis in the U.S. for a more targeted tariff regime that would be substantially less than what Trump has done, but also more than, say, even Joe Biden had done. I think there is a sea change in the U.S. of support for more tariffs than there were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But I don't think there's support for this kind of tariff aside from the president. But, the president's the president. And he's the one who, at least until the courts rule this illegal, which they may do in a year or two, we will see, he's the one who's going to be driving the policy. And so I just think we have to be realistic about that. Now I will say, kind of to the administration's credit, you could see starting last fall, the administration started realizing some of the tariffs were sufficiently increasing costs on the United States people, and were sufficiently unpopular. They started quietly walking them back. So, for example, late last fall, he removed the tariffs on a bunch of foodstuffs, like coffee and, a bunch of things that weren't even grown in the United States. So you could see he was feeling that consumer pressure. He is also, interestingly, in some of the trade deals, been willing to find an outlet for other consumer costs. So from a U.S. perspective, a lot of inexpensive clothing in the US for a number of years has been made in Central America and countries like Guatemala. Sort of baby children's clothing, inexpensive clothing. As part of the trade deal he signed with Guatemala, he's actually exempted clothing altogether. So like that's also a kind of an outlet for finding, dealing with the consumer costs. He hasn't had to sort of say across the board, I'm getting rid of clothing tariffs, but, as part of this deal, he kind of gets rid of some. So he has been, I think, kind of below the level that draws public attention, looking for some ways to address some of these consumer cost issues while being able to publicly maintain, no, we are having all of these tariffs at a high headline rate.
So which groups do you think get through and get the exemption? So that, when calls, and calls the USTR or calls the contact at the White House and says, by the way, Mr. President, this is bad for this constituency. Who are the ones that get through?
Yeah, so I think clearly we have seen some of the kind of food and agricultural interests get through because we've seen reductions there. I will say the US technology companies tend to get through. I mean, cell phones right now and computers by and large completely exempt from his tariffs. They keep talking about imposing tariffs on computer chips for data center build out, but so far the data center build out is all basically tariff free. So like those guys have gotten through. I guess the other way of looking at it is it's very clear that Trump is particularly committed to tariffs on steel, aluminum, and cars. Like, he's very, it's been very clear at sort of the flip side, like those are industries he is very, very committed to tariffs on. And it has been very hard for those industries to get major tariff relief. I think the pharmaceutical industry has been interesting, and kind of an example of where industry has maybe been able to kind of work with the administration. So Trump earlier this year announced very high headline rate, 100% headline rate tariffs on patented pharmaceuticals, not kind of generic medicines, like aspirin, but on patent modern medicines. But if you look at how that thing was actually implemented, it announced 100% headline tariff. Only about 4% of U.S. or 5% of U.S. Drug imports will actually pay that 100%, because what he did was he struck deals with individual companies for onshoring production over time in the U.S. He had a deal as part of his deal with the European Union. Pharmaceuticals made in the European Union were going to be capped at 15% tariff. So like what's interesting is it let him say, I have 100% tariff, but almost no one is actually paying that 100% tariff due to the various bespoke deals, either at a company level or at a country or jurisdiction level that he negotiated. And so I think sometimes he's willing to do that, where you see high headline rate, lots of loopholes. But steel and cars, man, he's just real attached to the tariffs.
Well, steel is not new.
Yeah, no, it's not new.
The original 232 of coming from heaven was steel and aluminum. So I think that's,
yes.
I mean, that shouldn't shock anyone. I think it's fair to say that Germany is still very concerned over the 301 investigation on pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, on the MFN. Yeah. So I mean, that is, I guess, apart from Turnberry, or is that extra? I mean, I think that there are a lot of holders who are looking for their way in there.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting. I mean, so one lesson with Trump, as I said earlier, Julia, I think the Trump administration's broad intent is to stick with and honor Turnberry. I also think, Donald Trump, going back to his real estate days, you read his book, he likes to come in and have additional last minute demands, right? That's what he's wanted to do since he was building apartments in New York in the 70s and 80s. And I think that he has kind of, and some of the folks around him, they have this Turnberry deal, but you know what? He really wants European countries to pay more for their pharmaceuticals. And he has, like, his point here is actually kind of, well, US Americans, we here in the US tend to pay more than anyone else on earth for our drugs. And he is trying to bring some of those prices down. He's trying to get Medicare to bring prices down. And he has kind of a view of, well, if we are going to pay less here in the US and we want the drug companies to continue to earn lots of profits and do R&D, somebody else has to pay more. So it's not like a crazy kind of theory, but he kind of realized, oh, like Europe should be paying more. And that's a little bit outside of Turnberry. And he also got the UK to pay more. I mean, the UK, not enormously more, but the UK did commit earlier this year to spending, I think it's about $5 billion more for drugs over 5 or 10 years than they otherwise would have. So he feels like, oh, I got one country to do it. And, he sees this as a tool to lean on Germany to pay more for your pharmaceuticals. It's kind of adjacent to Turnberry, but you're just going to have to deal with a little bit more. I mean, this is Donald Trump. Like, I think the deal will stick, but there's always going to be some friction and some back and forth and him asking for a little bit more.
A little bit more. I mean, again, as an American, understanding the prices of healthcare in the country, I had a bicycle accident a couple of months ago and went to the hospital to get an x-ray. I thought I might have broken a rib. I just got the bill this morning for x-rays, hospital visit, emergency room, €60.
Yeah. So, and here it would have been hundreds. I mean, hundreds and hundreds.
If not thousands. If not thousands.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean,
when we talk about this isn't going to encourage Germany to agree with Trump, because I can't imagine anyone on the screen wants to pay thousands of dollars for an x-ray.
No, but I think that there is, there is a certain degree of sympathy with the American problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but again, but is Carney going to take this additional, again, if news reports are correct, the last minute throw on transshipment and French language labeling seems to have, again, how much is this sort of this tax gonna?
I think, it's unfortunate how much of a row we have had with Canada. I was actually in Toronto, sort of coincidentally, I was at a conference in Toronto on Thursday and Friday of last week, which is something I'd agreed to before this row all flared up. So, but it was interesting to hear Canadian perspectives in the room, and it's interesting to hear US perspectives. I am reasonably optimistic that the US and Canada will manage to get through this current row, and that we will, late this year or early next year, get to a kind of point where we have renegotiated the USMCA. Neither side will be fully happy with what that looks like. The Canadians will not be fully happy. We will not be fully happy. But that's the nature of a compromise deal, is that no one, you're not always, often all sides are not fully happy because it's, so I'm reasonably optimistic on that. I can't rule out other outcomes where this does go south and, tariffs further escalate and that. But again, having talked to some folks on both sides, I'm going to be optimistic that we will get to a deal. I think we have to be, again, a point of President Trump is the president. In our system, the president has a lot of discretion and a lot of power. And we do have to, I do think we have to be realistic that in addition to there being legitimate and long-standing trade complaints with the Canadians. Look, when I was in the Biden White House, we had issues with the Canadian, with long-standing issues with them on dairy market issues and on airplanes and lumber. There are, they're great neighbors, but like neighbors in your real life, sometimes you have nasty fights with your neighbors over fences and, all that, right? It's that kind of thing, right? We have to be realistic. It's a good relationship. There have been long-standing tensions. I think we can get past all of that. Trump obviously kind of is unhappy with Mark Carney these days, right? Carney's been out speaking against the way Trump is running the country and the international order. And there is this personal dislike element that is an added complicating factor to those negotiations beyond the kind of substantive issues. But I am going to be optimistic that we just, talking to folks on both sides, I think there is a landing zone, and I'm going to be optimistic we get past it.
Yeah.
Or get to it, get to the landing zone.
I think I would agree with you there. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with Davos speeches, but I think, there are a lot of, there are more deals being inked between Canada and Germany than I think have ever been.
Yeah.
Which, look, it's good for everybody. It's fine. But I think that there are, there are consequences for this. But so maybe we could turn to China.
Yeah.
Where are we there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Let me break the China conversation into two halves. One is kind of what the US wants from its allies on China, and then second is the US-China bilateral relationship. And I think on the US-China bilateral relationship, what the administration as a whole would like is a relatively orderly, pretty broad decoupling between the US and China on a bilateral basis. So they would like the US tariffs on China to be materially higher than the US tariffs on allied countries. Right now, they're actually not, for kind of quirks of the way our legal system has worked and their own, like they have this meeting with Xi coming up and he doesn't wanted to raise tariffs right before that. But I think we are on a trajectory to having somewhat higher US tariffs on China than on other countries to encourage diversification. We have also seen this administration in a pretty aggressive way announce plans to impose what I think of as kind of per se bans on lots of Chinese products. So, for example, Chinese electric vehicles are effectively banned in the United States, not because of the tariffs, but on national security grounds because of the way in which they have sensors and cameras and connect to the internet. We have also seen the administration announce bans on various kinds of imports of drones and robots. Now, on paper, those are global bans that aren't just about China, but the way the administration is planning to implement those bans is to carve out various non-Chinese imports to let, Korean and German and Japanese type imports come in. So they're using these like per se ban authorities really pretty aggressively. And I think we do envision, despite the kind of summitry and like wanting to have some strategic stability, which I'm sympathetic to, like we should have some strategic stability in the relationship. I think they are picturing over a couple of years a pretty broad decoupling from China. That's hard to do. These guys are not the most orderly, they don't have the most disciplined policy process. So I think it is TBD whether they actually get there. But I do think that's the goal. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to what Trump wants from our trading partners on China, I think that they would like to cooperate with our trading partners on sort of what are the sectors where we collectively don't want Chinese product in our market. But, and here's the but, because I was in Brussels over the summer, and I got this sort of view in Brussels of, we're ready to cooperate with the Americans now. Maybe we weren't under Biden, now we are, but you all don't want to cooperate with us. That's not how the Trump administration sees it. The Trump administration sees it, we're willing to cooperate with you, but we're not going to pay you to cooperate. And here's kind of a practical example.
What does that mean, pay you?
Yeah, so what that means is, we have seen over the last couple of months, the EU took a decision under procurement authorities to ban Chinese inverters, which are kind of power module components in new EU grid infrastructure. The US, under a different authority, has effectively banned new Chinese inverters in US electrical equipment. It's not coincidence, right? I think both sides were actually talking there. We share a concern about inverters. Let's both ban them. So I think there's an interest in like, here are products we don't want. Let's figure out under our regulatory authorities how we can each ban those products. Where they're not willing to pay you, the Trump administration's view is Europe should be doing this ban on inverters or tariffs on Chinese cars because it's in your interest. And so we are not going to reduce our tariffs on your cars in exchange for you raising a barrier to China. They're going to be like, it's in your interest to ban Chinese cars. It's in our interest to ban Chinese cars. We should all ban Chinese cars, but also we're still going to maintain a 15% tariff rate on European cars, right? It's like we should cooperate, but we're not going to, in the Trump administration's view, pay you for cooperating with us by reducing our barriers on Europe in exchange for Europe raising barriers on China.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess you could sort of understand that logic, although
I'm not agreeing. I think this is
I know. I mean, of course,
policy, but that's how they see it.
Right, and a lot of and in a lot of instances, and it's not like I don't necessarily have some sympathies for this argument, is to say Europe moves too slow, we're not going to wait for you, and that's but I think again, like there is the tide is turning here, and I think that the Chancellor of Germany will say so publicly now, that like if there is an excess capacity 301 in the works, well, the European Union has one right now too, effectively. And wouldn't it be a happy accident if both sides stumbled into that together? Of course, the difference is, we can only take a cut on one side, and if you cut us on the other side,
and no, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, there are some positive signs here and there, but we have to see them in implementation. So, a much smaller thing over the summer. So I hadn't gotten into a big picture. The president, the Commerce Department a few weeks ago announced tariffs on solar imports into the United States. This is a product category that cuts across countries. It's tariffs on solar imports. And it's interesting because most tariffs are what we call in the wonk community ad valorem tariffs. It's like 20% on the value of a product. The way many of these tariffs are structured is it actually establishes a minimum import price. So the minimum import price is like, I don't remember the number, but call it, $20 per kilogram or something on polysilicon. And it basically, the tariff due is whatever the difference is between the actual cost of that and $20. So if the actual cost is $6, it's a $16 or it's a $14 tariff. If the actual cost is $10, it's a $10 minimum import price. And this is being applied on a global basis. However, in the details of this order, it held out that if other countries adopted a minimum import price of their own, you could see the US could reduce the tariffs on those countries that adopted a minimum import price of their own. And you can see the Trump administration thinking about this in the critical minerals space as well. There are a couple of sectors, like critical minerals, now we see it with solar goods, where at least some parts of the Trump administration are open to this idea that in those sectors, if the European Union and Japan and Korea adopted kind of a common external tariff or external minimum price on critical minerals and solar, the US would drop maybe all the way to zero its tariffs on those products. Again, they've laid that out conceptually. We have not seen that in implementation yet. From where I sit, I would very much like to see that in implementation, because I think for all these markets to work and for the alliances to work, we need a much more collective approach to this than we are seeing under the Trump administration. Again, they've held it out kind of conceptually, haven't yet implemented it. I think that's an area to watch, however.
Mm-hmm. How much do you think that the small yard high fence concept that you and a couple of others developed has held?
Not at all. And I'm not sure it ever was going to hold, frankly. I think even under the Biden, under another Democratic administration, I think there is, in the US, there is a strong constituency for a fairly wide yard to be de-risked or decoupled from China. And so I don't think, I mean, I just look at over the last year, when Jake Sullivan talked about we're going to focus on, semiconductors and quantum and clean energy technologies. Well, now we've added robots. Now we've added drones. Now we've added power grid equipment. Like, we just keep adding the sectors that we are going to de-risk from. And from a US perspective, well, there is plenty of US domestic opposition to the tariffs on allies, to Canada tariffs. The kind of adding all these sectors to the sectors we're going to de-risk from China on, by and large, bipartisan support. So I don't think the sort of small yard part of that was ever going to hold, and we have certainly not seen it hold under the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, is that just inevitable because the Chinese threat has widened? I mean, you have the Chinese now have robot armies. So
yeah, I mean, I do that. I think it's an interesting. I think it was always going to be hard to hold because, and I think this is just like let me step back a little bit. I mean, Julie, think about you doing strategic, sort of not just economic, but sort of big picture strategy. The U.S. has been in the process over a number of years now, and a big conversation about right or wrong. We've been in the process of a number of years now of defining China as a strategic competitor or a strategic adversary. But, you look at the language our policy officials are using, that's what comes up. If you are dealing with a country you see as an adversary, or at the minimum, a kind of strategic competitor, that is going to push you to a fairly broad level of wanting to have what in Europe you'd call strategic autonomy and not dependence on them. And so I think like having a framing of China as something like an adversary just holding a small yard of decoupling when we're talking about them as our greatest strategic rival, et cetera, et cetera. That was always going to be a very hard thing to hold.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get it. I mean, what sort of the follow-on question is what's the domestic policy response? I mean, again, you have major European corporations that have high exposure to China, and up until very recently would have put every roadblock in potentially to try to keep the European Union from imposing countervailing duties, are now asking for it. But there has to be, again, a domestic policy response to it. And I think that, like, if you, again, there was key legislation under the Biden administration. Some of it is, for ideological reasons in the renewable energy front. Please, let's not even get into that. But I mean, again, I don't necessarily see in America an equivalent industrial policy response besides, cutting some specific deals that look a little bit like Jersey's.
Yeah, I think this has been one of the really weak parts of American policy over the last couple of years, and I go back to, I'll give a specific example of a narrow thing where the Biden administration did push on some decoupling. I want to say in late 23 or early 24, the Biden administration got worried about Chinese at maritime cargo terminals, got worried about the use of Chinese cranes to load and unload containers because the cranes have lots of sensors and cameras, for unloading and loading containers. And the Biden administration got worried about, are these Chinese made and in some cases Chinese operated cranes able to watch what military equipment is coming in and out of our ports? So the Coast Guard announced a ban that would be phased in over a number of years of new Chinese cranes at U.S. ports. And the same day they announced that ban, they also announced a deal with Mitsui, the Japanese industrial conglomerate, where the Biden administration was giving some loans and some infrastructure money to Mitsui to, over a couple of years, start building cranes here in the United States, some, scale up capacity here in the United States. Right. And if you are going to do a ban and you don't want to just like not have the product, you need the industrial the industrial policy to build the product. And I worry about this on EVs. I worry we are headed in the US towards a trajectory where we have banned EVs and Chinese EVs, and we just kind of continue to make gas guzzling internal combustion cars. And 10 years from now, we here in the US are going to feel like I've always sort of imagined, folks in the Eastern Bloc in the late 80s felt of like, driving Ladas, which are just a decade out of date, over what the cars are in the whole rest of the world. Like, I worry we're on that trajectory and we've like protected our market, but we're all just going to be driving a bunch of Ladas, that's what I worry the trajectory we're on. Because I very much agree with you that if these, the Chinese are inventive. They have, you see that in the EVs, like they have great technology. You see that in robots. Like you just watch some of these clips online. And I've also seen some Chinese robots deployed out, sort of in not here in the US, but in other countries. Like they're amazing. These are amazing pieces of technology. And if the US wants to have those products, rather than just kind of, we have a bunch of out-of-date robots, we have a bunch of out-of-date cars, we don't have drones because right now the Chinese make most of the drones. We're banning those. We don't build many drones ourselves. Without the industrial policy, we are just going to have less access to that kind of technology. And I do think it's been a real shortfall under the Trump administration to do a lot of these bans without an industrial policy solution. And let's be realistic. In many cases, that industrial policy solution is going to require or should encourage the involvement of U.S. allies and partners. I remember when I was in the Biden administration, we were talking a lot on the EV build out. Well, how do we feel about Chinese battery technology? And there are like lots of pros and cons to Chinese battery technology. But for me, one of the big reasons to try to restrict Chinese battery technology was the other countries that had good battery technology were actually not the United States at the time. It was Korea and Japan. It was Samsung, it was SK, it was Panasonic. Panasonic was building the battery for Tesla. And I was like, look, if we want these countries to cooperate with us against China, we should be preferring their battery technology to Chinese battery technology here in the US. Like, let's build an allied industrial base approach to this. And that part of the policy under the Trump administration has definitely fallen, I think, into too much disuse. Both they're not thinking about the industrial policy enough, and because they are so, as they themselves say, America first, I think they are really neglecting the way in which a collective de-risking from China can actually create some opportunity for allied economic integration.
Mm-hmm. What would be the first step if if we were able to say tabula rasa? Because again, like I personally can't. Again, like there will be in a protective environment for a long time. I don't think it's an accident that we have the Free Democratic Party here in Germany, the quote unquote traders. It has nothing to do with party leadership. It's been completely wiped out. We're not in a liberal moment in the global economy, right? We're not in a liberal moment. But again, we'll have a protectionist environment for a while, and maybe that's necessary in times of drastic technological changes, as we currently are in. What would be the first step that you would take and say, okay, I'm gonna give preferential treatment to allies. I'm not gonna be vindictive, and act like by the way, owner of a New York real estate that bankrupted itself. I'm from New York. We see it. What would be the first kind of structural maneuver you would make under a new administration?
Well, look, I think cars are a great example. I think that I said earlier, Trump is very attached to car tariffs. Like, it's very hard for me to see car tariffs, even on allies. You haggled them down to 15%. It's very hard for me to see under Trump with his attachment to cars. seeing those tariffs go away. I personally do think cars are a great and ripe industry for where if the EU, Japan, Korea, so other big car manufacturing and car market company, countries that are both big manufacturers in cars and also like buy a lot of cars, if they agreed to a kind of common external tariff or other restriction on Chinese cars, I think that would be a perfect example of where the US should go back to effectively zero. It was 2.5%, but effectively zero tariffs on cars, because it's a sort of industry. We all face the same challenge. I want the US car market not to sort of fall into legacy tech industry. I want them to have to compete with, new cars from Germany, to have to compete with new cars from Japan and Korea. So like that to me, where we have a collective external tariff in exchange for low tariff barriers amongst ourselves, that would be a good example. I will say, I do think, as I think about post-Trump, as you say, some protectionism and sort of just a different, even more neutral term, like a different way of thinking about economics is going to be here to stay. I do hope that all sides post-Trump will show some pragmatism and will look for incremental things we can do together. When I look back at the Biden administration, we kind of thought about trade policy for 2 or 3 years and then had very little time to actually do much on trade. I actually think it would be very useful for the next administration, whether it is, Marco Rubio or whether it is a Democrat, to like come up quickly out the gate with, here are some targeted deals that don't resolve everything, don't solve everything, but sort of show the US can do trade policy again and can actually strike some deals and kind of get the wheels going again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so. I mean,
yes, me too.
I hope so, but because I also mean the concern is, like this like kind of, like sometimes you feel like the European Union will sign a trade agreement with a block, a pile of rocks if they can, right? But they're because they're looking for alternative markets, and I think the overall question is, and the thing that I'm asking myself, and I think that we're talking about all the time here in Germany right now, by the way, of course, I don't think you've overlooked that the automobile industry here is also struggling.
Yes.
Is really how fast trade diversification can happen.
Yeah.
And again, I think that if there's a core recognition that China's a problem, right, that we're not going to try to sort of keep that dream living along as long as possible. But how much does how much is there actually trade trade sustainability, but also trade replacement, right? Again, if the Canadians say, okay, 80% of our trade is with the United States, within 2 years we got it down, we get it down to 70, right?
Yeah, look, we are going to have to all figure out how to move faster. One thing you got to give the Chinese credit for, they have figured out how to move fast. Look at how fast they are eating market share in Europe on the car market, right? And look at the way in which they were basically exporting globally. 5 or 6 years ago, they had effectively a 0% share of the global car export market, and now it's a very substantial. Like, we are going to have to figure out how to move at Chinese speed on a bunch of these things, which we have historically not shown a lot of ability to do. But I think we are going to have to do that. I should say, just because I know we're coming to the end of the hour, I do think it's important for us all, and something for folks in Europe to be thinking about. I do think the US, something the Trump administration wants to do is but something that would also carry on past the Trump administration, is we want to have a rethink about what we call rules of origin. This is what determines whether a car or computer or other product counts as German versus Mexican versus American. It's like, these are the rules that determine what country does this thing come from. And you really see the Trump administration focusing on this in the USMCA negotiations, where they want, on a number of different products, to basically say, whether it is an electronic product or a car where there are already some rules. They want to have these rules that are kind of for this thing to count as Mexican and get, very low tariffs according to Mexico. It can't have more than, X percentage of Chinese content. It can't have more than 20, 30%, whatever it is. Because what they are worried we have seen over the last couple of years is we've seen a lot of production of things that used to be kind of assembled in China. All the parts are put in a box and they're sent to Mexico and they're being assembled in Mexico, but it's really a Chinese thing, just assembled in Mexico. And that's legal under US law. Like, this isn't illegal, this is legal. But they want to change the rules of origin. And I think this is another area where post-Trump, it is going to be important for us across the Atlantic to work together on, like, how do we collectively think about what makes a product German versus American, and should we have a different way of thinking about the rules of origin? It's also just very practically something I know over the next year. The Trump administration is focusing right now on the rules of origin, changing them in the USMCA agreement. They are then going to start pushing on this elsewhere. Like, this is going to be coming next year to the European discussions as well.
I mean, that's fair. I also think that, given some of the subsidy structures in the European Union, such as the safe, that is a 60% European. Again, I think that's a fair place to play. Finally, in the last 3 minutes, how much does Iran affect all of this?
Oh, Iran has been such a fiasco with the United States, I think, to say the least. It's been such a, despite what the administration says on social media, it has been a complete fiasco. I think Iran is a challenge for the United States and its alliance structure in a couple of different ways. First of all, it is clearly just at a kind of military level, it has completely preoccupied the military. It's drained our stocks. It has reduced the ability of the U.S. to provide interceptors, whether in Asia or in Europe. So it's clearly been militarily very challenging. It has also really strained our alliances. You can speak to this better than I can, but I think there is a strong sense around the world of, well, the U.S. has blundered into this war that has, contributed to higher global energy prices and reduced the U.S. security commitment elsewhere. And now the U.S. wants help getting out of it. I think it has been a strategic fiasco for the U.S. When it comes to the other underappreciated part, and Julia, this having been in government with, together, the U.S. government, big and sprawling as it is, can only focus on a handful of issues. Yeah, really just one, most at a time. Yeah. And, when the entire cabinet is mostly now focused on Iran, it just means they are going to be focused less on how can we work with our allies on China economic issues? How can we, I don't want to comment too much on Russia because Trump has his own weird, but views on it. But how can we bring a successful end to the Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine? They can't focus on these other things when they're all stuck on dealing with the Iran fiasco. And I think that is kind of underappreciated abroad of when you get into these, U.S. government, as you say, Julie, can only focus on one thing. And clearly right now, Iran is going to continue to be the dominant focus for the government, at least for the, now, I don't know, however long we're sucked into this.
Yeah. I think that is my concern, that we're going to miss that America is going to miss a lot of ships that are sailing, and a lot of things.
I look back, for some sort of more historical writing, longer form writing I'm working. I look back and I think there's kind of an argument, part of why, and I think about China, and I know we're at time, but we all made a collective bet on China opening in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I do think part of why it took us so long to realize, wait, this bet isn't playing out the way we hoped it would, is that the 2000s and 2010s, at least in Washington, we were all focused on the Middle East, right? It was the Iraq War, Afghanistan, Syria, and it just meant there wasn't the same level of bandwidth of like, no, if you just look at what's going on, you know, the Chinese are kind of on the march, and people were aware of it, but like at the very top level, we're all focused on the Middle East. And I think we just kind of dropped the ball because, as you say, one thing, that's what the president, you know, that's what we focus on.
Thank you so much, Peter.
No, you bet. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Frankness, and to be continued. Come to Germany.
I'd love to. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.